Tatanka Iyotake is one of the most notable Native Americans to have lived in the 19th century, achieving legendary-like status. He was born in Dakota Territory, which is now modern-day Montana, in 1831 to the Lakota people and engaged in warfare against other Native American tribes and white settlers from an early age. Tatanka Iyotake later grew up to lead his people during years of resistance to the United States government. Not only was Sitting Bull a military leader and a medicine man, he was also regarded as a highly spiritual being, and it was legend that he could communicate with animals and experience visions of the future. Originally named Jumping Badger, he joined a raiding party against Crow warriors at just 14 years old, besting one of them in the process with a display of bravery and skill in combat. After this feat, Jumping Badger was renamed Tatanka Iyotake as a sign of respect, meaning Buffalo Bull sits down. His name was soon after abbreviated, and thus began the legend of Sitting Bull.
Originating from the Ohio Valley region, the Lakota tribe depended heavily on the Great Plains and the now famous Black Hills, located in North and South Dakota, territories which were not part of the original states. As the United States looked to expand the western frontier, white explorers first encountered the Lakota Indians during the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806. Tension ensued as the Lakota people would not permit the explorers to enter further into their lands. By the time Sitting Bull was born in 1831, the United States had unlawfully built Fort Laramie in Lakota Territory in response to rising tensions and the violence displayed between the natives and the settlers. For instance, the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors had been known to attack white settlers who had invaded their land.
During the mid-1800s, mass migration of white settlers from Europe to North Dakota only increased the tensions further, and in 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed between the United States and the Lakota to recognize Lakota sovereignty over the Great Plains in exchange for safe passage for American traders up and down the Oregon Trail. This treaty, however, was not enforced by the United States government, and settlers and traders continued to descend upon Lakota lands. When gold was discovered around the Lakota's sacred Black Hills, prospectors poured into the area and were attacked and harassed by bands of warriors in response to their unsolicited presence and disrespect shown towards sacred ground. From the 6 decades that had passed from initial contact between Americans and the Lakota to gold being found at the Black Hills, there were many battles, massacres, and an endless cycle of retaliation between both peoples. Building on his early established military prowess, Sitting Bull joined Oglala Lakota leader Red Cloud in efforts to maintain control of their lands against American invaders. Sitting Bull led raiding parties and attacks against forts throughout the upper Missouri River section. He also engaged in guerrilla warfare attacks against immigrants and settlers. Wanting to protect his and his people's independence, Sitting Bull refused to sign the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, claiming, "I wish all to know that I do not wish to sell any part of my country." However, many of Sitting Bull's allies signed the treaty agreeing to its conditions and moved from the plains into the Great Sioux Reservation, which was created by the American settlers in an attempt to control and contain the natives. Unfortunately for Sitting Bull, Sioux life soon became impossible as the white settlements in their territory led to huge changes in the landscape. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills of North Dakota led to increasing pressure on the United States government to exploit this resource. However, according to the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Black Hills belonged to the Sioux Indians. The desire for gold and quick riches further increased the tensions amongst the pioneers and the natives. The US government attempted to buy the Black Hills from the natives, however Sitting Bull and other native leaders refused to sell and move from their lands. Unable to acquire the Black Hills legally, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was terminated on grounds of native wrongdoing and Indian raids. Then, in 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer led the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Army expedition on an attack on one of Sitting Bull's camps near the Little Bighorn River. The camp was now the home to many refugees that had escaped from villages previously assaulted by the United States Army. However, Sitting Bull and his warriors were prepared for an attack and completely outnumbered the American soldiers. In a counterattack, the Lakota annihilated Custer and his men. This crushing defeat, later dubbed Custer's Last Stand, would also prove to be the last stand for Sitting Bull, as due to the humiliation of such a heavy loss, the US Army poured thousands more soldiers into the area, and Sitting Bull was forced to retreat into Canada.
Sitting Bull finally returned to America. However, due to the white settlers and their consumer-driven values, America was now a world which Sitting Bull no longer recognized. Sitting Bull went on to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and toured around the country as the main attraction. The once former great leader was paid $50 per week to complete one lap of the arena on horseback at each show. Of the sizable income he received from touring, Sitting Bull gave most of it away to the poor and the homeless. Scholars Scott Maglalson and Heidi Nees argue that the depiction of Sitting Bull in these productions is an example of the American construct of manifest destiny. They argue that this is an American fantasy which encourages the idea that the United States were destined to advance their sphere of influence and power westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean, terminating the native savages who stood in their way. It would be fair to suggest that this construct was essential to the collective American conscience in justifying Indian removal.
Shows such as the touring spectacle staged by Buffalo Bill Cody depicted the Native American not as a group of individuals, but rather as a horde of savage wild men bent on the ruination of the white trailblazer. The reality, as William Clark put it, was that the natives mostly received explorers very kindly, and that it was the express desire of his expedition to be seen by the Indians, as this would usually mean receiving hospitality. Comparing accounts such as this with the depictions of American Indians in Cody's shows and popular contemporary literature such as Last of the Mohican reveals the contradictions between the reality of relations between settlers and natives and their representation by whites. In James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, the intricacies and dissimilarities between different Native American nations are discarded in favour of a more simple depiction of the noble and the ignoble savage. The ignoble savage is characterized by the Indian horsemen who would vastly outnumber and attack Cody's frontiersmen as part of the performance. Sitting Bull, however, being decorated in combat and heralded as the Indian who killed Custer, would be paraded around arenas as a living, breathing spectacle of noble savagery. By refraining from defining the Wild West as a show, Cody's company implied that the depictions were not fictionalized performances, but objective, genuine enactments of real life. Furthermore, in Cody's significantly less spectacular but still well-attended lectures given throughout the United States, Sitting Bull would be seated on a podium in full view of the audience. He would sit silent and still while Cody would deliver his rhetoric, and the once great Indian chief would speak only briefly through a translator who would reportedly mistranslate Sitting Bull to present a more white-friendly message.
The generation by models of a real without origin or reality, or hyperreal. Baudrillard states that simulation is the process of creating reality through the imitation of the real. This occurs when an idea or an image is perpetuated in a certain way throughout history, causing it to lose any resemblance to the real. This concept can be applied when trying to understand Native Americans in relation to American culture. Early American literature, art, and shows like Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which featured Sitting Bull, often depicted the natives as uncivilized savages who were inferior to the white American settlers. This early representation was repeated and normalized through American media and art, which led to American and European citizens accepting the representations as truth, and as a result, stereotypes concerning Native Americans and their apparent savagery were soon formed. For instance, the popular children's game Cowboys vs. Indians is a prime example showing us how these early representations of Native Americans have prevailed throughout American culture. The cowboys are always portrayed as victorious American heroes, whereas the Indians are presented as the unruly and wild enemy. This not only shows us how Native Americans are perceived by the American public, but it also gives us an insight into American identity, as to be American is to be the opposite of Native American. Furthermore, traditional Native American items of clothing have been commercialized and simplified, and are now sold and packaged in America as fancy dress. This Native American fancy dress costume is not only degrading to Native Americans, but is the product of simulation as it lacks any resemblance to the original. One example being the feathered headdress, which is instantly associated with Native Americans, despite the fact only certain members of a tribe would have worn a headdress. Not to mention, the fancy dress costume is the ultimate stereotype, as it ignores the difference in traditional wear between tribes, making it clear to see that American culture has generalized and grouped Native Americans together, subsequently disregarding their diversity. As a result, what we perceive to be Indian is simply an imitation of the real. We are left now only with the simulacrum, which is where the representation determines the real, and where there is little or no distinction between the real and the simulation.
These ideas of the American other can also be found in Edward W. Said's work on Orientalism. Orientalism attempts to explain why we have preconceptions of people, in this case Europeans in relation to Native Americans. Said states that the West, Europe and the USA, looks through a lens which distorts the actual reality of places and people. It is a type of framework that we use to understand the unfamiliar and the strange, however it can make people appear different and threatening, and as a result stereotypes and misrepresentations can be formed. He argues that the idea and the image of an Indian is a white conception, therefore concluding that Native Americans are real, but the Indian representation is not, and is simply a white invention. Said connects the image of Indians to the image of the other by claiming that Sitting Bull was the epitome of what the other stood for, in terms of appearance and behaviour. Overall, since Sitting Bull had no recognisable similarities to white Europeans, he instantly fit the mould of what it meant to be Indian. This concept of the other helps explain why, despite the huge diversity, all Native Americans were classified as Indians, as ultimately all Native Americans were seen as the other.